They thought Karoline Leavitt was coming to praise justice, but she came to wage war with words. In a packed legal forum in Austin, Texas, what started as a calm debate turned into a battlefield of principles, truth, and courtroom scars. Karoline walked in with confidence, armed with stats, applause, and cameras rolling. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, quiet, still, unreadable, like a storm that hadn't decided when to strike. What happened next wasn't a debate. It was a dismantling, swift, brutal, and surgical. Karoline tried to corner Crockett with tough-on-crime talking points, but found herself outmaneuvered by legal brilliance no pollster could measure. In 7 minutes, the crowd's applause shifted, and the silence grew louder than any headline. If you believe in truth, justice, and the power of a single voice to change the conversation, this is a story you won't forget. Tap like if you've ever stood up for what's right, and hit subscribe to join a community that defends faith, freedom, and facts. Because today, Karoline Leavitt learned the hard way. You don't always win by speaking louder. Sometimes, the quietest voice in the room owns the law. The air inside the Dallas Civic Auditorium buzzed with the kind of electricity you feel before a storm. Rows of high-backed leather chairs, polished floors, and mahogany trim gave the room a courtroom elegance, but the tension that hung in the space wasn't about decor. It was about confrontation. Something was going to happen. You could feel it in your chest before you even found your seat. Outside, the sun scorched the pavement, but inside, the temperature dropped the moment Karoline Leavitt entered. She came in like a storm wrapped in silk, confident heels on hardwood, American flag lapel gleaming, press trailing close behind her like a shadow. At 27, she wasn't just the youngest press secretary in U.S. history. She was a fighter, the face of the new conservative generation. A woman who had walked the campaign trail with Trump, borne a child, and returned to the podium days after a brush with assassination rocked the country. She knew how to handle pressure. She lived for moments like this. Her entourage peeled away as she approached the stage. Karoline adjusted her blazer with a calm familiarity, scanning the room like she owned it. And for a moment, it looked like she did. The crowd responded with polite applause, some standing, others lifting phones to capture the image. She smiled, but not broadly. Just enough to say, "I came to win." The backdrop behind her bore the seal of the Justice and Liberty Legal Forum, a nationwide symposium designed to ignite conversation between policymakers, prosecutors, and legal scholars. Today's topic: prosecutorial power versus constitutional rights. On paper, it was a discussion, but in truth, it was a televised showdown. Because sitting just 20 feet away, in a simple black blazer and soft curls pinned back, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. No aides, no note cards, just folded hands and a gaze as steady as a sniper's. A former public defender from Texas, Crockett didn't come with flash. She didn't need to. Her reputation was already embedded in the granite of Texas courtrooms, calm, cutting, and terrifyingly precise. Karoline had debated senators, governors, and the occasional unhinged morning show host. But as she looked over at Jasmine Crockett, not flinching, not blinking, even she felt something shift. Still, Karoline leaned into the mic with the kind of poise that had earned her airtime and admiration. "Thank you," she began, voice crisp, practiced. "It's a privilege to be here among so many defenders of truth and law. I stand today not just as a public servant, but as a mother, a constitutional conservative, and a woman who believes our nation is in a crisis of justice." The applause was immediate. Cameras clicked. A few heads nodded firmly. This was familiar ground, red meat for a crowd that saw law and order as sacred. Karoline continued. "We live in a time when criminals are emboldened and victims are ignored, when data-driven justice is replacing moral judgment, when those who break the law are portrayed as the oppressed, and those who uphold it are villainized. That is not America. That is a distortion." A few murmurs of agreement. Someone in the back whispered, "Say it again." "But I have hope," she said, lifting her eyes. "Because I see rooms like this, full of people who haven't surrendered to fear, who still believe in law, order, and the wisdom of our Constitution. And today, I look forward to a civil conversation, one based on facts, on records, on outcomes. She glanced sideways, just enough to suggest where those outcomes had often fallen short. Especially with my colleague, Congresswoman Crockett, she said, letting the name land like a dropped gavel. The room held its breath. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. The moderator, a silver-haired professor from Duke, cleared his throat, nervously. "Thank you, Ms. Leavitt," he said. "Congresswoman Crockett, your opening thoughts?" A beat passed. Crockett leaned forward. The mic barely picked up the breath before her words. "I'm not here for applause," she said. And just like that, the room changed. People shifted in their chairs, phones lowered, because something was coming. You could feel it. And Karoline Leavitt, for the first time in her career, wasn't sure she was ready. Karoline Leavitt leaned back in her chair, a practiced smirk playing across her face. She'd opened strong, clean, confident, and in command. This was her domain, the arena of persuasion. She had faced rooms like this before and won them over with the steady rhythm of bullet point truths. It was all about shaping the narrative before your opponent ever touched the mic. The moderator, still recovering from the chill of Crockett's opening line, cleared his throat again, awkwardly. "Ms. Leavitt, you wanted to begin with your data presentation?" Karoline nodded smoothly, standing and moving to the podium like a queen returning to her throne. Behind her, the screen lit up with a bold header, Florida vs. Failure, a case study in prosecutorial integrity. "I want to show you something," she said, clicking her remote. A slide of bar graphs appeared, crime rates, conviction rates, prosecutorial approval ratings. These are not just numbers, they're families, they're neighborhoods. They're proof that when we allow prosecutors to do their jobs, without political interference, we see results. She paced slowly, confidently, like a professor lecturing a particularly obedient class. Florida, under strong leadership, saw a 15% drop in violent crime convictions over the past 2 years. Repeat offenders are being tracked more aggressively. Justice, real justice, is being served. Some heads in the crowd nodded, but others remained neutral. A few glanced back toward Crockett. Karoline clicked again. A photo of a young girl flashed onto the screen. "This is Melanie Brooks," she said, her tone lowering to evoke emotion. Age 9, killed by a gang member who had been released early under so-called reform policies. Her family didn't get a second chance, and that's what we lose when we trade accountability for leniency. A ripple of reaction ran through the audience. Gasps, tightened jaws. One man near the front wiped his glasses. "I bring this up because Congresswoman Crockett's party wants you to believe that second chances always make sense, that releasing people quicker makes us more humane. But I ask you this, how humane is it to bury your child?" Silence. Karoline let it stretch. The room was hers again, or so she thought. "I've walked with victims," she continued. "I've listened to mothers who cry themselves to sleep because the system forgot them. We cannot afford to abandon common sense. She turned to the table where Crockett sat, fixing her with a look that was less confrontational than it was performative. "And while I respect my colleague's background in defense," she said, "there is a difference between protecting rights and protecting repeat offenders. I ask you, what kind of justice are we really defending?" Applause, louder this time, choppy but sincere. Karoline's team, watching from the wings, exchanged pleased nods, but Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. Her posture hadn't changed. She sat like a cliff facing a storm. The moderator cleared his throat again, visibly rattled now. "Congresswoman Crockett, would you care to respond?" Crockett rose, slow and deliberate. No papers, no slideshow, just her. She stood in the exact center of the stage, placing both hands on the podium. And when she spoke, it wasn't just a rebuttal, it was something older, wiser. "I was a public defender in Dallas County," she said calmly, "and I have a file drawer filled with names that don't make it into PowerPoints." The audience shifted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "You see, justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like an overworked mother begging the court for mercy. Sometimes it's a teenage boy railroaded by a public system that ran out of time and patience." She paused, then added, "Sometimes justice looks like listening, not sentencing." Karoline folded her arms. Crockett looked directly at her. "I'm not here to defend criminals. I'm here to defend the Constitution. The idea that we don't hand out justice like fast food, that we slow down, that we look, that we care." The silence was deeper now, not awkward, just heavy, intentional. "I know about victims," Crockett said, her voice suddenly taut with memory. "I've sat with the mother of a girl who was raped by a man the system failed to monitor. I've also sat with the mother of a boy who spent 6 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit because the prosecutor needed a win more than the truth." A stir ran through the crowd. "This isn't about sides," she said. "It's about balance, about not letting political wins outweigh the moral losses." The moderator leaned forward, caught in the gravity of her tone. Crockett stepped away from the podium. Just one step. But it made the room lean with her. "You say victims want swift justice," she said, glancing toward Karoline. "But justice isn't always about speed. It's about truth. And truth doesn't always fit in a press release." The words hung there. You could feel them tighten the room, like a fist closing around something fragile. Karoline sat frozen, her fingers pressed tightly together, her jaw locked, because something was shifting, and everyone could feel it. A quiet voice from the back spoke. "Let her speak." No one interrupted. And Jasmine Crockett, who hadn't raised her voice once, had just stolen the room. Karoline's throat tightened as she straightened in her seat. The crowd had gone quiet. Too quiet. She scanned their faces and noticed it, the subtle shift in posture, the turned heads, the way the room was now tilted, not toward her, but toward the woman she'd once brushed off as a mere former public defender. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The moderator glanced her way. "Ms. Leavitt, would you like to respond?" Karoline arose quickly, covering her hesitation with a practiced smile. "Of course." She stepped back to the podium, but something was different. The mic felt colder, the lights harsher. Her voice, even as it rang out strong, lacked the ease it had held just 10 minutes before. "I hear the Congresswoman's stories," she said, "and they're powerful. I won't pretend they're not. But policy isn't built on anecdotes. It's built on patterns, data, principles. And the principle we're losing is accountability." Some nods from the back, but they were fewer now. Karoline pressed forward. "The idea that we should slow down justice, that's not how real people live. When a child is attacked, when a grandmother is carjacked, those families don't want a dissertation. They want action." Crockett didn't blink. "Let me be very clear," Karoline said, gripping the sides of the podium. "No one is suggesting we abandon due process. But we also cannot allow our criminal justice system to turn into a therapy session. Justice must be firm, swift, and unapologetic." A few scattered claps, polite, not passionate. She turned to the audience. "We cannot build a justice system around excuses. We must build it around results." Then, locking eyes with Crockett, she said, "And the Constitution? It also says to ensure domestic tranquility. That means protecting the law-abiding, not just the accused." This time, Crockett rose before the moderator could even speak. She walked slowly to the center again, and this time, she brought the storm with her. "You want results?" she asked, voice low. "Let me give you one." She didn't touch the mic. She didn't need to. The room had tilted again. Everyone leaned in. "In 2019, a boy named Reggie Thompson was arrested in this very state," she said, "charged with armed robbery. No priors, no weapon found. Just a faulty witness statement and a system eager to check a box." She paused. "He spent 17 months in pretrial detention. 17. Before the case collapsed. Evidence disproved. But he'd already lost his job, his apartment, his father. A collective breath. Now, he works night shifts in a warehouse, can't get housing because of the pending charge still sitting on his record, and he's never received an apology." Crockett looked at Karoline. "That's your result." Silence. "And Reggie," she added, "was lucky. Others lose more." Karoline opened her mouth, but Crockett raised her hand gently. "Let me finish," and no one objected. "You say we need to protect the law-abiding," she continued. "But who decides who's law-abiding? An arrest record? A neighborhood? A skin color?" A visible ripple. Crockett stepped closer to the audience. "I've seen young men arrested for jaywalking because they matched a description. I've seen women threatened with child services over late rent. I've defended teenagers who took plea deals for crimes they didn't commit because they were terrified of what would happen if they fought it." The room was no longer passive. It was listening, processing, reckoning. Crockett turned back to Karoline. "You said justice must be swift. But swift for who? You want firm justice? Try being a single mother facing a prosecutor who sees you as a case number, not a person. Try telling your child that the justice system will protect them when it's already labeled them a threat." The silence turned sharp. "You talk about the Constitution," Crockett said, "but the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments don't come with disclaimers. They don't expire when someone's inconvenient. They don't fade when an election's on the line." She stopped, let the weight drop. Karoline's jaw was tense now. Her fingers tapped silently against the podium. "You built your argument on a tragedy," Crockett said. "I won't disrespect that. But when you build policy on fear, you get injustice. Mandatory minimums, 3-strike laws, sentencing disparities, kids tried as adults." A hand went up from a woman near the front. The moderator gestured. "Yes?" The woman stood, elderly. Her voice cracked, but it rang clear. "My grandson took a plea deal last year," she said. "He was innocent, but he was scared. Said the public defender told him he'd lose if he didn't." She looked at Karoline. "That justice?" Karoline hesitated. "That's unfortunate, ma'am, but nothing," the woman interrupted. "You say victims want speed, but some of us just want honesty." Applause broke out, not loud, but unmistakably sincere. Crockett turned slowly. "This isn't about being soft," she said. "It's about being smart. It's about being just. And if we're going to talk about justice, we better be ready to look it in the face, even when it's uncomfortable." Her voice lowered, and especially when it doesn't fit on a campaign flyer. The audience sat stunned. Karoline looked down, then up. But the spotlight wasn't on her anymore, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just spoken. She'd laid the courtroom bare. The moment Crockett sat down, the air in the auditorium shifted. The silence was no longer just silence. It was charged, almost sacred. A space had been carved out, and it wasn't for Karoline. The moderator fidgeted, unsure how to proceed. He cleared his throat, tried to smile, and said, "We'll now open the floor to audience questions." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying the uncertainty that now governed the room. Karoline sat still, one hand on her thigh, the other clenched under the table. She wasn't angry, yet. But something was twisting in her chest, something unfamiliar. She had come to win with sound bites. Instead, she'd walked straight into a reckoning. A law student in the second row stood up, clean-shaven, fresh suit, unsure eyes. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, "you mentioned prosecutorial discretion being dangerous. But how do we balance the need for reform with the need for safety? People are scared. Isn't speed sometimes necessary?" Crockett leaned forward. "I'm glad you asked that. Because fear," she said, her voice calm, "is the easiest currency to spend when you don't want to have a hard conversation." The student blinked. She continued, "Speed doesn't equal safety. It equals shortcuts. It equals missed evidence. It equals prosecutors padding stats while families think justice is being served. But if that justice convicts the innocent or ruins lives before a trial, is that really safety or just theater?" The student sat down slowly. A few heads nodded in agreement. Karoline finally rose again. She couldn't sit through another answer, not without regaining control. "I appreciate the passion, truly," she said, standing tall. "But this is where idealism meets reality. I've walked the communities. I've stood at candlelight vigils with grieving parents who begged us to move faster, not slower." Her voice sharpened. "The system isn't perfect, but hamstringing it with bureaucratic hesitation won't make it better. It'll make it dangerous. That's not justice. That's paralysis. For a moment, the room wavered. She had force, she had fire. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. "Let me tell you what real paralysis is." And with that, she turned to the audience again. Paralysis is a single mother working 3 jobs who can't afford bail and loses custody of her kids while waiting for a misdemeanor trial. Paralysis is a teenager who gets labeled a felon for carrying weed while another kid 2 zip codes over gets rehab and a second chance. She looked back at Karoline. Paralysis is pretending justice is served just because it was served quickly. A murmur swept through the room. A middle-aged man raised his hand. "Ms. Leavitt, you keep saying we need speed," he said, voice steady. "But have you ever sat in a courtroom and watched a kid sob while they're being sentenced for something they barely understood?" Karoline opened her mouth. He continued, "Because I have. My nephew, 18, never been in trouble, took a plea deal to avoid 25 years, even though the case against him was paper thin. He cried when he signed. Not because he was guilty, but because he was scared." The crowd was still. Karoline looked down for a moment, just a flicker, then back up. "I understand your pain," she said, "but we can't build policy around exceptions." "Then maybe," the man said, louder now, "they shouldn't be so common." Crockett didn't speak. She didn't need to. The audience was doing it for her now. The moderator intervened. "Perhaps we can return to our panel closing remarks." Karoline stepped forward. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "I believe in justice," she said, "but I also believe in law, and we cannot let emotional storytelling replace data-driven solutions. Our communities are suffering. People are dying. That's real." She turned to Crockett, voice firm. "Are you saying we should wait, watch crime climb, let the innocent suffer because we're too afraid to be decisive?" Crockett stood slowly. "No," she said simply. "I'm saying justice without truth is just punishment." The final sentence landed like a gavel. Even the cameras panned to the audience, not Karoline. Even the moderator, shaken, only managed to say, "We'll take a short recess." As people rose from their chairs, the energy in the room was unlike anything Karoline had felt in her career. She heard whispers, saw glances, some curious, some sympathetic, others skeptical. She walked off stage and turned into the hallway, alone. For the first time, her staff didn't follow immediately. Meanwhile, Crockett remained in her seat. A group of young attendees gathered near her, law students, public defenders, community leaders. One offered a notebook, another asked for advice. One just said, "Thank you." Outside, reporters were already pushing out headlines. Karoline faces unexpected reckoning at legal forum. Jasmine Crockett silences the room with constitutional firepower. And on social media, clips were spreading, not of charts or graphs, but of quiet truths, a 17-month pretrial detention, a broken plea deal, a grandmother challenging the very definition of justice. By the time Karoline returned to her team, they had their tablets open, eyes wide. "Clips going viral," someone muttered, "but not ours." Karoline exhaled, deep, sharp, not because she had lost, but because she had underestimated what it would feel like. And she hadn't yet realized. Karoline stood alone in the back corridor, her hand resting lightly on the cool metal handle of the side door. She could hear the crowd murmuring behind her, feel the gravity of something slipping, not just attention, but authority. Her staff's eyes were glued to their screens. The metrics didn't lie. The most replayed moment wasn't hers. It was Jasmine's quiet, unshakable sentence. "Justice without truth is just punishment." She turned away from the noise, pressing her back to the wall. Her thoughts ran wild. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This was about credibility, control, the kind of control she had always wielded from behind the podium, behind the press releases. But today she'd misread the crowd, misread the moment, misread the woman across from her. Inside the hall, the moderator tapped the mic and welcomed everyone back. The crowd was slower to settle this time, not out of boredom, but reflection. People weren't returning to be entertained. They were returning because something had shifted, and they didn't want to miss what came next. "Congresswoman Crockett," the moderator said, "you have the floor for closing remarks." Jasmine stood slowly. She didn't approach the mic. Instead, she stood beside the table, hands clasped, gaze steady. "I wasn't supposed to win this room," she began. "I know that. I'm not a headline maker. I'm not polished in sound bites. And I didn't come here expecting to be applauded." She looked around. "But I came to say something that I hope sticks with you beyond today." A pause, just long enough. "We talk about justice like it's a slogan, like it's a campaign brand or a courtroom speech. But justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's lonely. Sometimes it's the one voice in a room that says, 'No, this isn't right.'" You could hear the click of a pen, the faint squeak of a chair, but no one interrupted. "I've defended people who never got a second chance, people who were convicted not because they were guilty, but because they were invisible. And when I hear phrases like speed over scrutiny, data over humanity, I think about those faces, about the tears in their mothers' eyes, about the empty chairs at dinner tables that didn't need to be empty." Fucked. She moved toward the mic now gently, not to seize control, but to carry weight. "Justice without mercy," she said, "is tyranny dressed up in procedure." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They breathed together, listening not just with their ears, but with something deeper. And then, the moment. Karoline stepped forward from the wings, re-entering the room. The cameras shifted. People turned. Phones lifted. She walked to the stage slowly, heels clicking softer than before. "May I respond?" she asked the moderator. He nodded, uneasy. Karoline took the mic, exhaled, and began. "I've always believed that leadership means strength," she said. "And for most of my career, I've measured that strength in numbers, laws, charts." She paused. "But today I saw a different kind of strength." Her voice was quieter now, not defeated, but human. "I came here to defend justice, and I still believe in consequences, in order, in accountability. But I also believe we can't call something justice if it only serves the powerful, or if it moves so fast, it forgets who it's moving over." A hush swept through the room. "I didn't expect to agree with my colleague on this stage," she said, turning to Crockett. "But I see now that maybe the law doesn't have to choose between order and compassion. Maybe it just takes more courage to do both." Crockett blinked, but said nothing. Karoline stepped back. And for the first time all day, the applause wasn't for the winner of a debate. It was for the possibility of a different kind of justice. The next day, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's speech hit 1.4 million views. The line, "Justice without truth is just punishment," was quoted in law school classes, tweeted by pastors, and reposted by public defenders from coast to coast. Karoline's moment, her unexpected concession, her softened tone, didn't go unnoticed either. Some praised it. Others called it weakness. But one conservative columnist wrote, "It's not weakness to listen. It's wisdom to know when the system you love needs fixing." In the weeks that followed, bills began quietly circulating in state legislatures. Nothing radical, just small reforms. Mandatory body camera audits, independent bail reviews, new guidelines for plea deal transparency. And in one district in rural Texas, a judge who'd once refused to consider case delays began asking new questions. The next time Jasmine Crockett took the stage, it wasn't a debate. It was a lecture at a university. The room was packed with students. One of them raised his hand and asked, "Do you think what happened at that forum changed anything?" Crockett smiled. Not wide, just enough. "It changed the room," she said, "and sometimes that's where history starts." If this story made you think, even for a moment, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because truth doesn't always shout, but when it speaks, it echoes.